Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and today we are here to celebrate the release of Ling Guen from Ai Jiang. Probably pronouncing all of that wrong, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Oh, God, I enjoyed it so much, and I can't wait to hear this in Ai's voice. We're also doing something special tonight. We have 4 copies of the book to give away. If you're interested, please private message me in the chat, and we will randomly select some of those email addresses and get you a free copy of the book. Also, if you have any questions during the interview segment of the event, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will do our best to get to all of them. Ai Jiang is a Chinese-Canadian writer, a Nebula Award finalist, and an immigrant from Fujian. She is a member of the HWA, SFWA, and Codex. Her work can be found in fantasy and science fiction, the dark, uncanny, among others. She is a recipient of the Odyssey Workshop's 2022 Fresh Voices Scholarship and the author of Ling Guen and I Am AI. I'm going to hand it over to Ai to read a section of the book for us.
All right. So I will be reading from the opening of Ling Guen. Wenqi. I stumble dizzy and carsick into the kitchen to find Mother unpacking. Her eyes dart everywhere rather than focusing on the task at hand. Bowls and plates litter the island, the dining table, and the edges of the sink. Cupboards sit open, empty. Father stands next to her, rubbing a hand across his doubled chin, running a finger along a growing shadow of a mustache. His other hand rests against the sink, twitching, not knowing where else to place it or what he should be doing with it. The agent said it might take a while before he appears, Mother says in a feverish whisper, fixing her hair the way she used to right before leaving for a job interview. Before we got the house, she worked in a travel agency downtown, but that didn't last long. Mother said there was a new coworker who too closely resembled what my brother would have looked like as an adult. Their names were also similar. In the pamphlet she gave us, it says placing the items or photos around the house might help, Father says. Mother flings herself over to a box by the fridge and rips it open. She takes out several framed family photos. None are recent. All the pictures, like my brother, are frozen in time. Mother hurries around the house while Father and I stare. She places a frame on the dining table and one on the coffee table in the living room. Her footsteps thunder up the stairs. Doors open, close, open, close. Footsteps pitter, patter, pitter, patter. She returns, and I imagine she has placed a similar family portrait on the desk in my room. Mother, with her hand on my shoulder, the other hand on my brother's. Father behind her with a hand at her waist and the other on my brother's head. When Mother returns, she grabs a stack of unframed photos, this time of only my brother. Ultrasounds, preschool, and kindergarten pictures. Him in a graduation cap holding a certificate of excellence at the end of first grade. His photos end there. A younger me, half my brother's age, stands in the picture, clutching his arm with a wobbly smile and missing teeth. My brother was always the golden child, the one who carried the family's honor, the one who would have carried the family's name as per tradition, unlike me, who will only carry the name of my husband if I marry. Mother and father often try to convince me that they are not as traditional as their parents, yet they dote on my brother, the firstborn son, and often forgot about me. They still do, even though he's gone. I am convinced that, had they been offered their choice, my parents would have traded my life for my brother's with little hesitation. At least, Mother would have, and probably still would, if given the chance. I grew up hearing her complain often how Father's mother was always insisting that my parents try for another son, but Mother was, and still is, too heartbroken to think about children. Mother disappears again. Father and I wait, listening to the ticking of a small clock, the same one Mother used for my brother's reading hours back when we still lived in Fuzhou. I still remember the way my brother drew me closer when he read, so I could see the words, but they were always too advanced for my age. I can recall the images, but I don't recognize the Chinese characters in my memories. After Mother sets everything up, The three of us sit in the living room waiting for something to happen, for my brother's promised appearance, but nothing does. Mrs. The new arrivals to the neighborhood moved into the house across the street. There's only one reason anyone would trek through the guarding trees to get to home, not to seek new life, but to satisfy a longing for the dead. Houses and homes sate the unending hunger of those most vulnerable, unsuspecting. They feed on our desires, our pain, so much pain, and to wallow in such pain, it is a hideous thing. Isn't it strange how everyone here desires their home to be haunted? You wonder if the newcomers will be the same as the others. You wonder if they too will be unrelenting, or perhaps they will be like you, unhaunted. That is the excerpt.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So in this wonderful book, you did something really cool that a lot of people would consider breaking the rules. But I was delighted to find this in the book. You alternate between first, second, and third person. This is a really unique approach. So what made you decide to use this technique, and how did you utilize it to propel forward the different parts of the narrative?
So it's funny because when I first started writing Linghun, I had only had the two perspectives of Wenqi and Liam, so the first and the third person. But as I was writing it, we felt that there was something missing to the narrative, like another voice that was struggling to be heard. So when I was writing Mrs., I oftentimes when like write a new character, I just allow the character to tell me what voice they are in. And so Mrs. was a second person because of this, but also because of the fact that her life has so, like, I'll try not to spoil too much, but because of the fact her life has been very dictated by others, she refers to herself as a second person because she doesn't feel like herself anymore. She feels like someone that has been shaped and molded by someone else. So when she talks to herself, it's you are this, you are that, you are doing this, rather than what most of us might think to ourselves, oh, why, you know, like I am doing this, I am doing that. But I feel like um, in terms of Liam, he's been in this place for so long. And so I use third person to give a sense of like removedness from himself, but also from all those things around him and people around him. And I thought third person really captured that kind of numbness that home has drilled into him, essentially.
Well, it was a wonderful variety of perspective and distance from the story. I think that was very effective. Now, when you said we, do you mean you and your beta readers? Do you mean you and your editor? How are that decision made?
So when I was writing the thing, after I did my first draft, Rob and Anna, my editors at Dark Matter, they're such lovely people to work with. We bounced ideas off each other on how like the narrative was shaped up, and they gave me a lot of different ideas, and then I would take the ideas and then try to think about how to change those ideas to better fit my own narrative and like the intention of it all. And that's how a lot of it was written, and like how Mrs. Perspective came to be, because we were talking about the concept of immigration, because home is such a big thing in this narrative. But then I didn't want to center the story as a whole on immigration necessarily. Um, so yeah, if that answers your question.
Tell us about the theme of attempting to hold on to the past and the risks of getting stuck in the past as you tried to hold on to it.
I feel like in holding on to the past, it's kind of like we are not letting a part of us go. I was talking about this during the in-person launch, actually, about like the concept of time and how moving on to like a different stage of your life is kind of like a mini death for um, yourself as a person, right? So like from when you're a child to a teenager, your child self kind of like passes away, and then from your teenage self to adulthood. And but then I think us as humans, we really try to hold on to like like ourselves in the past as much as we hold on to the people in the past. But in doing so, it is very difficult for us to move forward in life. And I feel like in that sense, like life moves on so quickly when we are trying to so desperately hold on to the past.
And in the story, a lot of the characters are experiencing different and extreme stages of grief. What made you want to address and write about the nature of grief and how that's different from one person to another?
I feel like a lot of the times when I write, it's always to kind of explore something that boggles my mind about the world, whether it's like politically, socially, culturally, or like individually. And grief is definitely one of those things that I can never wrap my mind around, right? It is such like an abstract thing sometimes if you think about it. And so in writing Lincoln, I was trying to understand the different ways that people experience grief and the different ways why they might want to hold on to the dead or might not want to hold on to the dead. And the explanations as to what is it about grief that drives people to such to take such drastic measures sometimes. Of course, in Lincoln, it's kind of exaggerated, right? But if you really think about it, there are people in real life who might go to very drastic measures in order to kind of like reclaim their loved ones, or like, if that makes sense.
Indeed, indeed. Um, and to me, this story was about grief, but it's also about ghosts. And in literature, ghosts are often presented as spirits that don't want to let go of the material world. That they're the ones hanging on. But in your story, it's very much the living that are clinging to the dead. Um, what inspired you to go with this reversal of roles, and what challenges came up in writing a ghost story that is very different from the conventional ghost story?
I feel like when I was thinking about the concept of ghosts and how they manifest in narratives these days, and how we think about ghosts outside of like media representations of them, where a lot of times they're like maleficent spirits that take revenge on the living, or they're like haunting because they can't let go of something in our world, right? But then I thought about how a lot of the times we are holding on to memories of the dead, and how they kind of like manifest as ghosts to us through those memories, and how they are like very much stalled in time. When we think about the concept of ghosts, we think about them in the sense that they don't, like, they are not moving on in time. You kind of think about them that they have passed in, right? So if someone has passed in, child ghost, but then that is mostly like what the living think about as.
You're breaking up a little bit. Hopefully, we're not losing connection here.
Oh
Um,
no.
one thing that I also found interesting about the way ghosts were handled in this story, and I'll try not to give too much away here, but the interaction with the ghost is very personal. They're not omnipresent for those around. It's very specific, and each person has a different relationship with the particular ghost. How did you handle this, and what difficulties were there in addressing it that way?
I feel like there is always a difficulty when writing, in the sense that you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? Think from like a very different perspective outside of your own. And there's always the idea of like writing what you know. And um, so I feel like that was definitely one of the challenges in that I had to really explore how different people might experience the idea of ghosts and what different people might connect to the idea of ghosts, whether it is like the ghost of a person or maybe a ghost of the place or like a ghost of oneself, and the different ways they might mistake each one of these things for the other, depending on who is looking at the concept of ghosts.
And the book also has a very strong theme of family obligation versus independence. It's not exactly a coming of age story, but it's dealing with young people that are finding their independence and stifled in their situation. Can you speak to your use of this theme and what it means for you? Why did you want to add this in? And I say coming of age, but it's not a coming of age book. I don't want to give the wrong idea, but it does have the concerns of youth and independence very strongly throughout.
I think growing up, like I was largely restricted by at least from my father, what he wanted for my life and like the path of my life and the direction, such as career or, like educational choices and whatnot. And I feel like a lot of children, not just me, also feel this pressure to kind of like uphold like familial duty, or like kind of accomplish their parents' dreams, or because their parents brought them into the world, try to not disappoint them by following their decisions. But I feel like it creates a lot of angst in kids who are already like feeling very directionless in life or not very happy with the direction they're going to. And I feel like that really manifested in the characters of Wenqi and Liam, and that they feel very dictated by their parents in all the decisions and aspects of their life. And so they so desperately want to break free as a result of it.
And you don't have to answer this one if you don't want to, but in the process of becoming a writer and the steps you've gone through to get where you are, do you feel that there was adversity in that process? What hurdles did you have to go through to become the writer that you want to be when other people perhaps thought a different path was better for you?
Um, so before, like when I first said I wanted to pursue writing, there was obviously a lot of pushback against it, right? Because it's not like a very certain path compared to some careers, but in the the job market these days, what really is certain anyways? But comparatively, it is very uncertain because especially for my parents, it's not like one of those careers that are very clear cut. You have like a very clear path where you go to university, you get your internships or things like that, and then you move up the ladder that way, right? Let's say in like a if you work for a company or whatnot. Um, so in thinking about writing, they told me to like only treat it as a hobby because I was going to become homeless. Or like the gist of it was that. Um yeah, but it's really funny because they've become very supportive of me recently once they've seen like that there is a path in writing even though it's a very difficult one. Um so
I think it's a common misconception that writing is easier than other professions because it's actually extremely difficult. Um, and congratulations for finding your way. Despite I think careers in the humanities are usually iffy for for parents. It's not the most stable way to do. However, you've been kicking butt with this writing thing, and you are an extremely prolific short story writer as well as novelist. In fact, the book also features several short stories. Do you have a preference for any particular length or format when you're writing? When do you reach for one versus another? And what challenges do you find unique to each format? I mean, you're also a wonderful poet.
um, I might need you to repeat all those questions as I go through all the answers. But in terms of preferences, I think I can't answer that until I finally finish my first novel. So I can get a taste of that format too. But I feel like I don't have a specific preference for format. I more so just let the story tell me how long they want to be. Um, and kind of just lean into that. I find that sometimes I'll have an idea, but then when I start writing it, it turns into a poem. Or I have an idea that I think it's a novel, and then it turns into a short story. Or idea that's a short story, but then becomes like a novella or like a novel length thing, and I have to like put it aside for later, right?
So does the story always dictate what ends up happening length and format wise, or sometimes do you put those constraints on yourself where all right, it's got to be this many words?
I think it depends on what I'm writing for. If I'm just writing for myself and not for something specifically commissioned, then I will just let the story run free. But let's say it's for like an anthology with like a word minimum or a word cap, then I'll really try to stretch myself to meet those.
Sorry there, I was just typing. If anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, please. Also, we're doing a raffle giveaway, so if you want to DM me in the chat your email address, we will pick 4 winners to get a copy of the book. So this is a horror book. You also have a science fiction book coming, I Am Ai. Can you tell us a little bit about that one, spoiler free if you can, and what it's like working in one genre versus another? When do you reach for one versus another? Do you find the challenges unique? How does your research differ from one project to the next?
So, yeah, spoiler free. Um, I Am I is basically about a cyborg, ironically named I, because I just had to write it with the play on my name. So it's about a cyborg named I who is desperately trying to become an actual AI in a world that's demanding a lot of humans to become more and more efficient, especially with technology growing in dominance and threatening to take over a lot of jobs. So that is the gist of um, I Am I. But in terms of writing a multi-genre, I find it sometimes geographically linked, if that makes sense. Because in Edinburgh, the atmosphere, the weather, the architecture was all very gothic. And that is where I wrote a lot of my horror, actually. And that is where I wrote the entirety of Linghuan. Um, but when I find myself in Toronto, I write a lot of sci-fi for some reason. Um, and my current novel is sci-fi, but I feel like there are some ideas that just lean better into one genre than another, at least for me as a person, like personally exploring these ideas. Like the concept of death and grief for me is very, very psychological. And I like to explore in a narrative where I focus a lot less on the world building aspects or like, like the technology or the mystical creatures or whatnot. Though eventually maybe I will explore it in those worlds. But um and for sci-fi and fantasy, I find myself leaning a lot more into like political and social commentary um and different ideas concerning those that have been floating around, especially that I read like, on Twitter or on the news, definitely influence my sci-fi writing.
And if I understand correctly, when you first started writing, you weren't writing speculative fiction, you were writing literary fiction. What drew you towards speculative fiction, and how are those processes different for you?
So it's very funny because I grew up reading speculative fiction, but then when I went into university and I studied English literature, they only gave me like realist classics, right? from like the 18th, 19th century. Sometimes you get more contemporary work, but mostly it's like stuff from the past. And there weren't a lot of choices in classes to take for speculative courses. I think there were like one or two that I took that I really loved. But so then when I came out and when I did a lot of writing, especially as like a newer writer, the works I read were big influences on my writing, right? And because I read so much realist work, that is what I started writing too. Because I was still trying to find my voice and the kind of genre I wanted to write in. And because I wasn't exposed to as much speculative fiction, I didn't write a lot of it. But as I became more exposed to it, when I was looking around the short story markets, and um, because there were also some literary markets I submitted to, which called like who called my work horror or like speculative fiction or like literary fiction with speculative bent, I started looking more into what it is and what they were saying about my work. But um, yeah, but I feel like genre work allows me to explore ideas with new ideas, if that makes sense, in like a newer world without a lot of our like real life constraints. And I just feel like that is so much more liberating. And I discover a lot more about what I'm trying to explore compared to if I just set it in a real world with like very human and very human architecturally um, limited things, if that makes sense.
What were some of the speculative works that drew you to the other side of genre?
I think it was those that like first you would study in university, right? That like, you know, the profs would deem as studyable genre works. Um, so Shirley Jackson and like Bram Stoker, they study a lot of those in university. But also Kazuo Ishiguro was a very interesting one because he is a very quote unquote literary writer, but then he has a lot of speculative elements in his work, even though people still call it literary fiction. Kind of like Clara and the Sun, it's technically science fiction, but some people are like, no, it's just literary fiction. Um, or like Never Let Me Go is very dystopian. But I feel like it's voices like his, among others, like Ted Chiang and Toni Morrison, that kind of like bring the speculative into reality that first introduced me to genre and speculative work.
Ted's work is so brilliant. I can't praise him enough. We've got a couple great questions from the audience here. You mentioned at this one's from Lauren. You mentioned at one point that you listen to how the individual character wants to come through. Could you speak more about the experience you have of meeting a new character and how this relates to the plots that develop around them? And they go on, is the character usually the first thing that you encounter?
So I am very much an ideas and concept writer in the way that it's always kind of like a theme or a question that I want to explore first before the character comes. So I'll kind of think about um, the world and the different ideas of that world and what I want to explore. And then the character who is most impacted by that world will usually show up.
So world building and character usually follow the ideas for you.
Yes. So theme and idea first, and then kind of like the society and culture of the world, and then it's the characters.
There's another one from the audience. In Small Tales from Between Worlds, is that a horror collection that reflects grief, anxiety, depression that we all experience? And a two-part question here. When researching, do you gather Western and Eastern religion and philosophical influences to go into the work?
So I feel like a lot of the times, rather than research, I draw on my own experiences and the stories and things I've heard from family, or the things I've seen in different like forms of media. So because I have exposure to both, like heavy exposure to both Western and Eastern media, it like seeps into my work. And I try to reinvent the ideas that I have experienced while exploring them in my work. But in terms of like specific research, I don't do a lot of that for my short stories unless it's like very specifically, let's say, folklore, mythologically targeted. Um, but for my novels, I've been doing a little more of that research because I'm like drawing more historical inspirations for those.
And you mentioned in the afterword of this book, looking for it here. Um, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but a different type of spirit. How did that inspire your ghosts?
So I actually couldn't find a lot of information on that spirit, but then I knew broadly what that spirit was. And it says that, so what you were talking about, I had briefly talked about in my um, ending personal essay in the book, which I will not spoil for those who have not read it. But it is an earthbound spirit that's kind of like tied to a certain place, but it's like a very vengeful spirit. So in thinking about that spirit, I didn't want to simply um, retell that kind of myth in my book, but kind of like reimagine it to as like spirits that are kept on this planet because of the living, rather than they are keeping themselves on this planet because there's still something left for them to do.
And when you say staying on the planet, that sort of suggest the possibility of going to other planets. Do you have any personal feelings about that in the afterlife?
I mean, I feel like often see death as like a different realm, one that can possibly intersect with our own realm as well. Um, but on different planets, I never really thought about that. But that would be cool to explore. I would love to see someone do like a space opera.
I think we're definitely bound to see more horror sci-fi overlap. There's certainly been some great examples of it in the past. This is another question from the audience. This one's from Lucy. Can you talk about more about your research project and how your project might be influenced by your research practices?
Um, So I am doing a lot of like historical research about ancient China for my current novel, but it's also supposed to be alternative history. And I try not to do too much research before I start writing because you never know what part of the research you actually need. Because it's very different from academic essay writing, where you have to have all your research in place before you start writing, right? But with narratives, you never know where your story is going to take you and what pieces of the research you will need until you get there. Um, so when I first started researching, I definitely went down a research rabbit hole where I just try to like take everything, like all the nitty gritty customs, religion, culture, but then almost none of it will make it in because it is alternative history. And even though I will draw on my research, it will be um, very briefly and it will be kind of like influenced by my research but not restricted by it. At least that is the direction I want to take with this particular piece. If it was like a very historically factual book, then I would approach it very differently.
I often think of fiction as a form of emotional history. When you're doing your research, do you read any fiction along with nonfiction to help find the threads of your story?
So I noticed like during my creative writing masters that whatever I read really influenced what I end up writing. So I try not to read too much fiction or at least too much within the genre I'm currently writing as I am writing. So which is helpful because I work in so many different genres, if I write horror, I'll try to read more fantasy and sci-fi. If I'm doing sci-fi, I'll read more horror and fantasy, so it doesn't really like influence my voice while I'm writing or like the ideas while I'm writing. But definitely like nonfiction lectures about different historical things, cultures, things like that, I find really inspiring to my writing.
So the next question I'm going to break into two parts. Congratulations, you are a Nebula finalist. This is huge, amazing, and well deserved. What's that experience been like for you? And has that, do you feel that that put pressure on your writing? Is it a relief? You know, how's that been for you emotionally?
Well, I did a lot of screaming while I first found out, and like live screaming right into the phone, right into the Sephora vice president's ear. So sorry. Um, but after that, because there was so much going on with like the Lincoln launch and everything else I was working on, it kind of just like slipped into the back of my mind because there's always more work to do. And um, I think there is a kind of pressure like with that label, but at the same time, because there's so much going on, I have not had the time to really let it settle within me. So it's like I am it, but I am not, if that makes sense.
Fair enough. Hey, it doesn't put an end to the work, of course. And you've also just attended Odyssey Workshop. Congratulations on that and earning the scholarship. What has that experience been like for you? What new directions do you think that's going to take you in your writing? And how has it affected your writing process in general?
It has been absolutely exhausting in the best way, of course. Because the workshop gives you a lot of new skills and like a lot of different ways to think about your own writing and different writing techniques and how to think about story and craft in general. And it's very hard to digest at once. I don't know how the 6 week program people did it. I have like 6 months, the stretched out extended version, and it's still absolutely difficult to try to digest everything. But I think it's also because I'm trying to kind of balance everything around the workshop in my life along with trying to focus on the workshop, which makes it very difficult because it's so intensive. But I do highly recommend it. It will boggle your mind a little bit, but once you let it settle, I'm sure it will like be very beneficial for your craft. Um, but I definitely think it's given me a lot of useful tools to implement into my own writing process and into my revision process. But at this moment, because there's so much to digest, I find myself writing a lot slower because I'm trying to think about all these little things that I've learned as I'm writing.
And so you've worked in the academic world, you've worked in the workshop world, and independently. How have these processes differed for you? You know, what things would you leave behind from one aspect, and what things have you really held on to?
So when I used to write essays, I always had the problem that I realized, but like from feedback from professors, I never expand enough on things. That was like a very persistent feedback from like my entire undergrad. And I think that has really bled into my fiction, where when I was first submitting, a lot of the personal feedback I got was, this story is too short. It needs to be longer for the ideas you're exploring. Like, how long do you want it? Because then I would make it longer and then I submit it. And then other people were like, it needs to be even longer. I'm like, well, then it's going to just become a novel and not a short story. Um, but I definitely think I do kind of like when I first started writing, especially approached short story writing almost essay style, if that makes sense. Kind of like event happens, you reflect on it. Event happens, you reflect on it. Um, but now as I'm like digging more into craft and like trying to play around with the rules of fiction, I kind of broke away from that very set structure. But that also means that some of my narratives might be very disjointed because of it and experimental. Um, but I feel much more liberated that way.
Well, you certainly broke some rules in this book, and to great effect. It's a brave and bold move, and you pulled it off. So awesome. We have a couple more questions from the audience here. This one's from Carlton. Do you participate in writing or reading groups?
So when I first started writing about 2.5 years ago, I actually joined like 7 different writing groups. Um, and I used to like swap my work with other writers a lot. So then for every one story I would like pass on to get feedback, there would be like 7 different writers giving feedback on my work, and then I would give my feedback to like 7 different writers. Um, but then slowly I became less active in those groups as I started like writing faster and sending things out faster, just not sustainable to try to get feedback on all the pieces and then try to give feedback to kind of like, balance out all those pieces. Cause then that would just be like 100 feedbacks in like a month or something like that. Um, yeah, so in the beginning, I was very actively seeking out critiques and exchanging critiques with others. Now it's like maybe a handful here and there, but not nearly as much as before.
And here's a comment/question from Diana in the audience. When we first start writing, we think of becoming an award-winning writer is the achievement. You're a rising star right at the beginning of your career, and you're in the running for a major award and have the satisfaction of reaching a point where your parents have changed their mind about seeing you as a writer. Seems like major writer goals achieved. What writer goals are still on your list, and has achieving these huge milestones impacted or changed your goals and definition of succeeding?
So one thing that was very funny um, was when I was applying for MFA programs, when I first came, like when I first graduated from university, took a year off, and I was applying for MFA programs, I did that very typical thing that you're not supposed to do in your MFA application letters, where you're like, you can't make like the sweeping ambitions because they know you're not gonna make like it come true in such a little time, right? And be like, so like I remember I ended one of my MFA application letters saying something, oh, it's gonna be really cringe. I don't even want to say it. But I said something like, I want to be a master storyteller like Stephen King or something. Oh, oh. Anyways, I did not do that again for any subsequent letters. Um, but I do feel like I'm a very ambitious person for sure, and I do like to aim high, but I also know how grueling it is to get there, if that makes sense. So I have a lot of things on my bucket list, a lot of things that might seem like astronomically high, so I will not say them. Um, but um, it does keep me humble and it does keep me working hard, I would say, to always like move the goalpost higher whenever something is reached and never settle uh, for what I already have. But it also means a lot more stress because you never feel satisfied with anything.
Fair enough. And there's nothing wrong with aiming high. In fact, I always write on the first page of my notebook, aim higher. So, it's good to push yourselves, but it can be stressful. Let's see, a couple comments here. Gideon Marcus is here, and he's offered to make you a Wikipedia page if you'd like one. I will
Oh,
put you two in touch later. Some congratulations. You are a master storyteller. Wonderful, high praise. And I tend to agree. This book has been absolutely wonderful. Almost last chance here. If you want to enter the raffle for a free copy of the book, please DM me your email address, and we will send out the. We will announce the winners in a few days when we have a chance to go through all of this. Thank you so much for joining me for this event. It's a wonderful book, and I'm really looking forward to reading your next. Hopefully we can do another event when the time comes. Before we go though, what are you currently working on? what's coming up next for you and what is exciting you about life and writing in general.
Oh boy. So I am working on my first novel. I'm like a third of the way in. It was supposed to be due to my agent in January. It is now April. It is not done. My deadline is now May 31st. So hopefully I will meet that. But there is that. And I have several writing projects planned for like the next few years. Um, that hopefully I'll complete and then get out to my agent, hopefully sell, and hopefully everyone will get to read it. Um, but what excites me a lot is the rise of horror recently. There's just been like a boom of it. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a pandemic, maybe it's the state of the world. I don't know. But it is lovely to see because I feel like horror is definitely one of those underappreciated genres, and how comforting sometimes horror can be, even though some people think it is only there to frighten you, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, so that is what excites me about the current publishing landscape so far. That and novellas. It seems like everyone is being more receptive to novellas and loving novellas. So that's nice to see.
I am also very excited about that. It's my preferred reading and writing format. 150 pages. Love it. Love it. I don't know why the publisher strayed away from that for a while, but it's exciting to see that coming back. Linguin, wonderful book. If you're watching on YouTube, there is a link below where you can get it, and you can also go to Ai's website to learn more about what she's up to. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us and your great questions. Thank you, Ai, for joining us and sharing an excerpt and answering my questions. A wonderful book. Definitely looking forward to more. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you for coming all, and thank you for hosting.